Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in the book On Being a Christian by Professor Hans Kuhn, published in 1976. We're going to take a look at pages 416 to 428, and we'll be looking at the emergence of first Christian dogma, specifically the doctrine of the cross. Let's look at block one, and we're going to look at interpretation again, the Gospels and critical reflection. The Gospels are not meant to be formal history. A new age is being addressed in the Gospels. Their desire is to stir a large audience to faith. There are shifts in emphasis, in fact, and in person. The Gospels are written as dramatic presentation. The drama of the narratives. There's action at many different levels. There's even liturgy-type features. It's best to describe the Gospels as narrative theology of Jesus and his cause. They are proclamation in the form of narrative or story. Therefore, block 1, note 3. Dramatic presentation of the Gospels and narrative theology of the Gospels equals the Gospels as narrative proclamation, as kerygma. Text and literary quality are of supreme importance to us because Jesus is our concrete model of behavior. Additionally, historical reality is extremely important as well. Jesus as concrete model of behavior. We are interested in the real within the Gospels, in the person of Jesus Christ. Our faith seeks the historical reality, therefore critical reflection must accompany our examination of the gospel narratives, and we will follow their programmatic call. So theoretically, Professor Kuhn tells us we are dealing with proclamation that seeks to stir faith. Therefore, we employ very critical reflection in order to gather the signs that represent the core truth, the core dogma of the gospel. And the most fundamental doctrine of all is the doctrine of the cross. So the concrete block 2 is going to address interpreting the cross, the most fundamental of doctrines. Block 2, note 1. Various interpretations emerge for the cross as a saving event. No one exclusive normative model exists in the New Testament. Juridical and cultic categories were enlisted, like the concept of righteousness, sacrifice, and sanctification, all as a struggle over the powers of evil. Jesus in the New Testament is seen as teacher, prophet, witness, judge, lamb, priest, and king. The cross is seen as redemption, liberation, forgiveness, purification, sanctification, reconciliation, and justification. Many diverse interpretations. Therefore, block 2, note 3, cross as saving event and diverse interpretations equals the cross of the first fruits. There was no uniform theory of the cross early on. Eventually, with Calvin, Protestant theology had Calvin teaching the threefold office of Christ as king, prophet, and priest. Augustine saw the cross as redemption. So that's a starting point. Note 4, Jesus' death as redemption. Unfortunately, theology became linked with canon law, and it created legal relationship between God and man. There was a perversion of the gospel resulting in legal terminology, legal relationship between God and man. Juridical concepts were enlisted, creating a moral legalistic trend for the theology of the cross. Very similar to Judaism rather than Paul. So early on, the church theology was corrupted with a moral legalistic trend. Ideas emerged of law, guilt, penalty, reward, penance in the Catholic Church and expiation in the Catholic Church. Jesus became new lawgiver. Redemption was based on works righteousness. Redemption was based on achievement. There was a re-Judaizing of Christianity. And it eventually led to Anselm's theory of satisfaction, which was the moment of perverting the gospel. Anselm, that's 1033 to 1109 for Anselm. So Block 2, Note 6, the theory of satisfaction, Anselm of Canterbury. He argued from above downward, sin has offended God's honor. Therefore, God's honor needs restoring by rendering an appropriate satisfaction, that satisfaction being the incarnation and the death of God's Son, and then his merits are applied to humanity. After Anselm, Aquinas emerged and corrected the problems with this theory of satisfaction. But initially, Professor Kuhn is telling us that just like it was recognized by Martin Luther and John Calvin and the Reformation thinkers, the gospel had been perverted by the church. It had been perverted. It had been turned into a works righteousness where you had to achieve satisfaction on a continual basis. You had to confess and then provide some kind of works righteousness to reach satisfaction. So theoretically in Block 1, we understand that we are dealing with narrative, the gospel narrative as proclamation, seeking to create faith. Concretely, that led to the positing of the first doctrine of the early church as interpreting the cross. And interpreting the cross began with Augustine, and he called the cross redemption. Not expiatory sacrifice, but redemption. But that was perverted, says Professor Kuhn, by the theory of satisfaction by Anselm of Canterbury. Now we can move into Block 3 and take a look at the conclusion to this transition into the first lesson, transitioning into dogma. And in Block 3, Professor Kuhn gives us his first initial triad. Christian doctrine, interpreting the cross, emerged as Augustine, affirmation of Augustine, negation of Anselm, and then the synthesis in Aquinas. Augustine, 354 to 430, posited cross as redemption. Anselm, 1033 to 1109, posited the theory of satisfaction and penance, doing penance to reach satisfaction, a perversion of the gospel and the grace of the gospel. Aquinas, 1225 to 1274, wrote his Summa Theologia, and we have studied the Summa Theologia at 121. If you remember, we had extensive lessons in the Summa Theologia. We have studied that doctrine. But Professor Kuhn says, Note 2, Block 3, Note 2, we must negate Anselm's theory of satisfaction. He adopted Augustine's theory of inherited sin. His objective of redemption is questionable, restoring the honor of God, and is dominated by legalistic logic, and the redeemed don't even look like redeemed. Complete perversion of the gospel, complete distortion of the gospel into a re-Judaizing of the gospel. So Block 3, Note 3, the false concept of Anselm's expiatory sacrifice. It creates misunderstandings. The Apostolic Proclamation did proclaim sacrifice. They did proclaim Jesus as Passover lamb, but the letter of Hebrews made the cross cultic sacrifice only as a criticism of Jewish cult. Therefore, the conclusion by Professor Kuhn is in Block 3, Note 4. Sacrifice must not be used in the Old Testament sense. Man has to be reconciled, not God, and it's due to God's initiative that man is reconciled. Jesus offered his personal self-surrender. Jesus is both priest and sacrifice, offered once and for all of humanity. Therefore, conclusions for the concept of sacrifice. Expiatory sacrifice is not the most important model for interpreting the cross. Reconciliation, representation, and redemption are the most important model for interpreting the cross. Self-offering refers to Jesus' way of life and his death. He is raised in resurrection as the crucified Messiah for us, the crucified Christ for us. The cross is historical fact with universal significance for all of humanity. The Eucharist, therefore, is not repetition of sacrifice. Professor Kuhn says Eucharist is not repetition of sacrifice. We are given a share in the body of Jesus. It is sacrament of memory. It is sacrament of thanksgiving. It is a covenant and community meal. It is not repetition of sacrifice. We get important teaching here from Professor Kuhn on this first lesson in the emergence of foundational Christian dogma, interpreting the cross, the doctrine of the cross. Critically important foundational doctrine. The dogma of the cross. And he tells us specifically that it emerged, in Block 2, it emerged, first of all, Augustine saw the cross as redemption. Block 2, Note 3. But then, Note 5 in Block 2, you had the moral legalistic trend in the early church. And you had ideas of law, guilt, penalty, reward, and the concept of penance, the idea of penance that needed to be done to achieve satisfaction. All of that dramatically distorted and perverted the gospel of grace. And that theory of satisfaction came from Anselm of Canterbury. And then we learned in the conclusion in Block 3 that for Professor Kuhn, dogma emerged as Augustine being affirmed, Anselm should be negated, Aquinas is our synthesis. And he'll get into this more later on, but initially he's just giving his outline to us. Augustine posited cross as redemption. Anselm posited a theory of satisfaction. Aquinas wrote a Summa Theologia, which will address the cross as well. But a correction needs to be made to the early perversion of the gospel. The theory of satisfaction needs to be negated. Why must we negate Anselm's theory of satisfaction? And he tells us it's because the objective of redemption is not restoring God's honor and using legalistic logic. That was a failure. That was a perversion of the grace of the gospel. He gave us his own conclusions for sacrifice. Expiatory sacrifice is not the model for interpreting the cross. The model for interpreting the cross is reconciliation, representation, and redemption, the 3 R's. Reconciliation, representation, and redemption. They are the model for interpreting the cross. Jesus is raised in resurrection as crucified for us. The cross is historical fact with universal significance. Therefore, we celebrate the Eucharist as a sacrament of memory and thanksgiving. A sacrament of memory and thanksgiving. Tremendous lesson on the first emergence of interpreting the cross. That's going to wrap up pages 416 to 428. We'll pick up next time on page 429.